Check those clocks, smart or dumb, not you, the clocks. We know you're smart because you listen to A Time to Think. That means you take a time wholly devoted, holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, and we hope.
Like holy guacamole at the store.
And we hope H-O-L-Y, wholly devoted to thinking, which we need to do because, Chris, we're supposed to love the Lord, our mind with our heart, our soul, our strength. Dang it, I was going to set up our mind for you to say, and I just said it. I just memorized the scripture.
To the punch, Josh.
Let's try this again. Woo! We're supposed to love the Lord with our heart, our strength, our soul, and
our mind.
Wow. Anyone who's met me knows I'm not perfect enough to hit that on the first shot. Welcome to A Time to Think. This is an arm of the church, which is designed to help with discipleship of the mind. We get it. We are in a culture where we are often dispersed. We are in the car for work. We are work at home and not in town. We don't often have 3, 4, 5 days a week where we can be together, which means as pastors, we don't get 4 or 5 days a week to indoctrinate you, which is our goal.
We can get in your car with you. We can be in the gym with you.
And we don't have to smell your car or the gym.
Bathroom with you.
Oh.
Anywhere you have access to digital media, we are there, we are listening, and we are watching.
You're like an elf on the shelf. That's what you are.
Actually, you are listening and kind of watching because on YouTube you can see just the logo.
Right.
But you are listening to us. This is Pastor Chris Tillman, pastor of Downtown Mission Church in Stevens Point.
Pastor Josh Holland, Al Pastor, as I call myself when I order tacos, of Downtown Mission Church in Wausau. And this is a time to think, a time for careful and thoughtful engagement with issues in the culture and the church, oftentimes issues in the culture that impact the church because it's unavoidable that issues in the culture are going to impact the church, that we need to know about them.
We're a church in culture, right? We're in context.
Exactly. And we are starting a new kind of spring/early summer endeavor to talk about what words we have in the Bible, whether or not they are God's words, and if so, how we can trust them.
Do we have the right ones?
Do we have the right ones?
Do we have the wrong ones?
And we're kind of going at it from what I kind of was describing to my wife as a backdoor approach. We're not starting off with, this is why we have the books we have.
Right.
We're starting off with really a critique that comes from the last few hundred years, popularized by a guy who's he was a professor of the author of the book. Mm-hmm. So Michael Kruger goes to college, if I understand correctly. He has Bart Ehrman as a professor and encounters these types. And that really sets the trajectory for Michael Kruger's career. He spends his career discounting Bart Ehrman's thesis.
It's like a Jedi that was trained by the Sith who is now working against the Sith. Yeah.
I want, if you run into Kruger at a conference or something, I want you to tell him that's how you view
You are like
his ministry.
Mace Windu. That's who you are, Michael Kruger.
And so Ehrman is popularizing an academic thesis. We know that happens all the time. I mean, critical race theory is an academic thesis that gets popularized.
Right.
Like these are, we have things in academia that get picked up for the popular culture. And then they're not only books that are published, but they become these kind of ideas that swim around and that we have to deal with.
Like Cartesian philosophy. I mean, we spent months talking about Strange New World.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so we're talking about something that may seem remote at first, but we hope that we'll continue to show you why it matters, why you encounter it more than you think, and why at the end of the day, it's really unsatisfying. And that's sometimes how I view arguments, Chris, where I go, that's not only wrong, it's just unsatisfying.
We want satisfying arguments, Josh.
We want to look
we
and
want
go,
Snickers level arguments.
Yeah, you're hungry for good arguments. Grab a Snickers level argument. Exactly. And that's, if an argument leaves you wanting, an argument is just unsatisfying when you look at the data, when you look at the evidence, you're going, that's just unsatisfying. Yeah. And eventually we'll get to the finer points of why Bauer's thesis historically is unsatisfying. That's where we'll go in the next few episodes. But before we even do that, I wanted to have a conversation, Chris, about continuing why we will often believe things that are not verified by the data, that are not verified by the history, that are not verified by facts. And to do that, I want you to give us an explanation of the triperspectival philosophy of Cornelius Van Til. That sounds like a big thing because it is. But give us a layman's understanding of how Van Til develops this three-pointed ideas of how we think about things in the world.
Yeah, so my discipleship was at the hands of a disciple of Van Til. So Van Til was a professor at Westminster Seminary many years ago, and in the 20th century, if you will. The
Wow.
last century, can you believe that? The last millennium,
Wow.
if you will. And so Cornelius Van Til was...
Before Y2K?
Before Y2K,
Wow.
yeah. So, excuse me, Cornelius Van Til was a professor who was fairly groundbreaking. I guess I'll use that word, groundbreaking, in what we would call Christian epistemology and Christian thought, because Westminster Seminary started through J. Gresham Machen, who had some big problems, a lot of issues with the rise of what would be the discussion point of our last episode of modernism undermining the claims of Scripture.
Right.
And so he had this famous little book, and by little book, it's a little book, Christianity and Liberalism.
Fantastic.
By J. Gresham Machen. And he outlines his issues. It's kind of the airing of grievances, the Festivus.
Yeah, Christianity and liberalism is his Festivus
it is his
with his
Festivus,
colleagues.
Yes. And so Machen goes off, and Festivus is the liberal, theologians of his era at Princeton and so forth. So Westminster Seminary starts. Cornelius Van Til comes on the scene, and Van Til is interested in the thought life of the Christian. Now, my acquaintance with triperspectivalism is directly from the guy who has pretty much popularized it. So John Frame was one of my professors at RTS. He's since retired, so you haven't had the privilege of having him. But John Frame has popularized this. He and another gentleman, Vern Poythress, another professor who was, I think, actually was at Westminster. And the idea is that we can approach life helpfully, and we're going to isolate it here because they kind of expand this all over the place.
Yeah.
But three different perspectives, and there's the normative, and there's the situational, and there's the existential.
You can imagine a triangle with 3 points.
Imagine a triangle. And so,
Not like a square.
It's kind of fun
like
because we talked about 3 points for sermons, last time. Now, I don't purposely come at my sermons looking for normative, situational, existential, but it does help provide a framework for thought, because as Van Til influences Frame, then Frame is influenced how I think and everything. The approach towards knowledge, the approach towards learning, the approach to the life of the mind is we have 3 different ways that we encounter information, right? And so the information that we have, that we encounter it in context, right? So that's situational in nature. How is this particular thing applied, understood within its particular setting? We have normative information that's just brute fact, right? Just straight up true statements. So, we take a look and say the wall is gray, right? Now, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that this wall is in this building. It's just the wall is gray is a statement of fact. And then existential is, what is your experience of this particular bit of information? So when it comes to applying that in how we think about things and when we approach this, what specifically would you like to apply that to as we think about this?
Yeah, so I think to set a bit of a trajectory for where we're going, chapter 2, which we'll take a couple weeks on, it's really the nitty-gritty of Bauer saying this is what happened at this point in time, and people saying, well, that's not really what happened.
Yeah.
And so chapter 2 really talks about how the claims of Bauer are at best highly unlikely, if not untrue.
Yeah.
And yet, we still have many people popularly believing these claims.
Mm-hmm.
And we have Bart Ehrman popularizing the claims. And there are times where Bart Ehrman even concedes that what he says is potentially unlikely.
Now, Bart Ehrman is still alive.
Still alive.
Teaches at...
Is it North Carolina still?
I think it's either UNC or Duke. It's one of the North Carolina schools, yeah.
And so my question is, Chris, we're going to spend some time saying essentially the brute fact component.
Yep.
The normative component. Here's what it is. Here's the facts.
Yep.
But what do we do when the existential component, another piece of that triangle, what people feel about the facts, how they interpret it, people still come away with... So let's take Jesus' resurrection, for instance. You look at the facts of Jesus' resurrection. The Romans were good at killing, so it's probably
Yeah.
true that they didn't kill him badly and he somehow was still alive.
Right.
Even if they killed him badly and he's somehow still alive, what's the likelihood that he was just up and walking around in a few days? Unlikely, right? So the historical nature of Romans' killing prowess and Jesus' physical state, even if he didn't die, lead
Yeah.
you to say, historically, the tomb was empty not because he was just maimed and got
There
up.
were not regular
right?
accounts of people
Yeah.
being crucified and walking around 2 days later, right?
Right. There were guards at the tomb. There were 500 people don't hallucinate the same thing at the same
Right.
time. So you add all these data together and you say it seems historically most likely that Jesus was resurrected, and yet Rudolf Bultmann says, hey, it's not actually that important.
Right.
It's what you feel about the resurrection. So we come in, Chris, having to encounter that type of
Yep.
cultural sphere. We have to be able to both say, here's the facts, but also what do we do when someone goes, well, my experience of that, or I don't feel like that's true. How do we approach the existential piece of that triangle? At what times is it appropriate to say, okay, this person is clearly ignoring brute facts, and then
Right.
how do we approach that person?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the existential corner is obviously the one I think that's winning out right now in our culture, the way that people approach things. We've even kind of, if we think about the triangle and the corner of normative, that normative has almost been, I guess if you can swallow it up, I mean, it's technically not even a triangle anymore if it's just 2 points, right? And so you might have a situation where people think, oh, well, my truth in this situation, or if other people just say my truth, because of how I feel. But the truth is really anathema now. The idea of the truth, the objective. And so, as it pertains to the issue of believing facts regarding Scripture specifically, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, the reception of documents that we regard historically to be faithfully representing what was first written by the apostles 2,000 years ago, right? I mean, that's what when we look at the New Testament text specifically, when we look at the Scriptures altogether, we believe these things to be, faithful representations of what has been given to us, right? And handed down for centuries and centuries. These are faithful representations of it. The question of experience, I think, usually comes in not as a matter of somebody saying, I don't feel that this is true, because I don't think that's normally the way that people respond. I think that the visceral reactions that people tend to have are a matter of, I don't want to believe this is true.
Sure.
And so I think the first layer there to kind of peel back for people, if we're going to be honest, is really asking the question about desire and how does desire feed experience? Because we don't necessarily gravitate toward experiences that we don't enjoy.
Sure.
Right? Like we're going to go and we're going to have, Lord willing, a lunch over at Jersey Mike's in a little bit.
Not a sponsor of the podcast.
Correct, yes.
Could be if you're listening.
But
Probably maybe not, because we don't want corporate influence.
yeah, exactly. No corporate influence. We don't want that. But, you introduced me to Jersey Mike's, a handful of months back. Providentially, they came into Plover around, the same time. So it's worked out well for
And
the
now you're
elder
broke.
team meetings. Yeah, exactly. All the money is at Jersey Mike's now. But, we're going to go there. And why are we going to go there? It's because we enjoy it. We like the food there. There's a reason we're not going to cross the border to Tebow, right? I mean, we're not going to go there because there could be consequences.
We only
that
have
are
so many
unpleasant.
toilets.
Right, exactly. There are consequences. And so, the existential informs how we make decisions, how we think about things, but the existential is driven by desire. It's driven primarily, if we think of the existential as a matter of experience, we want to pursue experiences that are pleasant. We want to avoid experiences that are unpleasant unless the unpleasantness tends toward a greater pleasantness in the future.
So if I'm tracking you, and I want you to keep going because this
Yeah.
is good, but if I'm tracking you properly, we hear someone say, I just can't believe that
Right.
God is like this.
Right.
That is an existential, it's driven from a desire not to have this type of thing, not to have this type of God, not to have this type of belief. So it's not just I feel like that's true. It's I desire it deeply not to be true.
Right.
And therefore I will overlook data to
Right.
the contrary of my desire.
Right, because a statement like, and I don't mean to sound kind of like a piddly little argument you have when you're a kid with a parent or something like that. It's like, I can't or I won't, those types of things. But here's the thing: if somebody says, I can't believe in a God, like ... right? So you might insert for contemporary purposes, I can't believe in a God that would condemn somebody's romantic life, right? Whatever that might look like for an individual, whether that's polyamory, whether it's, homosexuality, whether it's, any number of things, just, having a good old time sleeping around. I can't believe in a God who would care about that thing, right? That's a popular statement somebody might make. So you
I can't
hear
or I
that,
won't.
right? Exactly. Yeah. You hear that, and that type of a statement is intended. And again, there's so much subconsciously built into the statements that we make regarding these big issues that it's kind of strange if you think about the fact that we don't really analyze why we make statements about the most sweeping claims that are in front of us and the most important issues in life. We don't really analyze why we say the things we do. If somebody says, I can't believe in that, well, I can, right? So Chris Tillman can believe in a God who cares about what we do with our bodies, right? I can believe in that. So it's not impossible. Can is a matter of ability. So it's not impossible for you to believe in that because there are plenty of people who do believe in that. The question that we're wanting to ask then is, why won't you believe that? What is it about that you find difficult to believe? And that's where the existential becomes particularly problematic, because we don't look into our own motives, we don't look into our own intent, we don't look into our own hearts enough, and we give ourselves far too much credit to really understand why is it? Why would I not want? And this goes back to, I've quoted this 1,000 times, an old Tim Keller, maybe legend, I don't know at this point, because it's been cited so often, but Tim Keller would have people come in and say, I can't believe the Bible. I can't believe the Bible. These are high school students going to college, come back after their first year. I can't believe the Bible to be true. And he says, who have you been sleeping with? And, 9.8 times out of 10, that would do it right there. And they'd be like, okay, well, and it's because there's a moral component here. And one of the most helpful things about taking Dr. Frame when I was, at RTS was the highlighting regularly the fact that there is a moral component to knowledge. We don't simply encounter facts and make decisions on the basis of, is this true or not? We encounter facts, and we have to necessarily understand that we are also inserting our willingness to believe based on desire.
Think about how you gather data when you're angry.
Yeah.
Think about how you compile evidence when you're mad at your spouse. Think about, when you're self-justifying, when you're trying to moralize your own actions, think about how you compile data. You leave some things on the floor that don't help the cause. You highlight other things, and that's the human tendency. We have sinful desires. It's James 3 and 4. Sinful desires that cause us to quarrel and fight, and we use those to collect data in certain ways. So that's a helpful thing to say is, not only as we're pondering this personally, but if we do want to engage with others, our hope with this series of podcasts as we discuss the canon would be something that could be shareable, not only on social media, but with friends that you have that are interested in the claims of Christianity and all these things, in order to persuade people who are not already bought in. It's one thing to induce confidence in people that are already bought in, but to persuade someone who's not bought in, we have to understand some of the underlying currents that are at odds. So one of them we've talked about is postmodernism and metamodernism is just this reluctance to believe that anything is definitely true. That's a barrier.
Unless we want to believe, right?
So then if you're trying to persuade someone that is operating existentially and saying, okay, you've disproved that, let's kick the can. Let's go all the way down the road and say, wow, someone really believes that the claims of the heresy of orthodoxy are true and that we can trust the books in the scripture that we have, and they're historically verifiable, and the data is correct, the normative is there, the brute facts. But I won't believe that. I don't want to. I can't. How do we then engage with that type of existential move of the desire to believe or disbelieve things, overruling the data?
Biblically speaking, and this is kind of an interesting case, because I think about the churches that you and I grew up in. And we both grew up in mainline Protestant churches. And the theology informing the schooling of, the training of the pastors that we would have grown up with were both heavily influenced by what we're talking about here, heavily influenced by Bultmann and Schleiermacher and these types of guys who are all about the Christ of faith versus the Christ of history. And so the types of things that we got, growing up would have been very much driven by that. Now, I've thought at times about how do you have a conversation with and we'll just use specifically like a pastor in that particular setting, that particular tradition. And biblically speaking, there's a certain point, and I don't mean to like just completely pull the rug out from underneath our whole conversation here, because that's not what I'm doing, but there's a certain point where if somebody has gone to the length of basically saying, I don't want to believe this, that biblically, you just say, thank you for acknowledging that that's the case. I'm here to talk if your desire to believe changes. Because, one of the things that I think can be very unhelpful when it comes to Christian apologetics is our belief that if we just have enough time and we just use enough strength and force of argument to try to compel somebody to believe, that they will.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about the types of environments you and I grew up in, it's like, would it be sufficient for me to return to the church that I grew up at as a kid and try to persuade people who are there on the basis of, here is factual evidence suggesting that what you are being taught and believe is wrong? Would that be helpful? And it may be helpful if somebody is questioning. That's why when we talk about things of, sharing with a friend, it would not be helpful for you, listener, for us, so we want to go to Jersey Mike's today, to just show up at the counter and put your fold your arms on the counter and say, I got to tell you why your worldview is wrong right now.
Yeah.
I got to tell you why what you believe about the world is wrong unless you believe in biblical orthodoxy. Okay. Now, could that be a true statement? Yeah, absolutely. Right. But is the approach, and is Christian apologetics primarily concerned with strength of argument on the basis of you compelling, or is it based on strength of argument on the basis of what is actually accurate and true? So we believe that accuracy and truth will ultimately prevail in the hearts and minds of those in whom God is working. But for those in whom He's not working, it won't. So when somebody comes back to us and says, I just don't want to believe that to be true, I find that to be a helpful point of saying, we're being honest now. Yep. And if you want to have further discussion on the basis of acknowledging honestly where you're at, but this is where, when we try to determine in these conversations, is the acknowledgement of desire an acknowledgement of, I do recognize this to be true, but it's up for grabs? Or is somebody just saying, no, I don't want to? And so I think that's just a fine point of having conversations like this that is important. If you're going to Bart Ehrman himself, and saying, hey, Bart, here's the issue I have with this. It's like, no, I don't want this to be true.
Yeah.
I don't. All right, well, is this a conversation worth having at that point? So I think that's probably, just as an aside here, an apologetic aside, it's important for us to determine these things when we're talking with people.
Yeah, for sure. There's a wisdom and discernment there. I often think that apologetics is... we use this term for our 1 Timothy passage. It's clearing the rubble.
Yeah.
Apologetics is getting obstacles out of the way.
Yep.
So someone might have somewhere between 8 and 30 obstacles to belief in Christianity, and apologetics can help them see that their obstacles have valid answers or are untrue or they are misplaced or whatever, and you're just going to clear the rubble out of the way, but the narrow road is still a narrow road.
Exactly.
And Jesus said the narrow road is a narrow road for a reason.
Yeah.
And so you're right. Determining the place of apologetics, when you're discussing, you have to discern someone's heart or willingness to believe. You have to often in evangelism be able to bounce back and forth between having what counselors might call the presenting issue conversation. Mm-hmm. Someone's here to talk about this particular passage, and then discerning what's the underlying issue here. And so I find that often, particularly in a modern context where we're not talking to Christians, we're talking to postmodern people, we're talking increasingly to people who have not grown up even in the church. They don't have language of Trinity, Father, Son, Spirit, salvation, atonement. You're talking to people that are completely blank canvases. And I remember one of my last evangelistic efforts, I would be bouncing in between denominational differences, because that was a presenting issue. Mm-hmm. Someone was dating someone and he was trying to figure out why their denomination was different than my denomination, and that was the presenting issue. So we'd have a little conversation over here, and then almost every time I would draw it back to, do we have God's words and can we believe them?
Yeah.
And that was the underlying foundational thing. And so I think people will come to us with a disagreement against Christianity. That might be the presenting issue. Heresy of orthodoxy is helping with the underlying issue and can at least help us get that other person to a point where they say, okay, the normative piece of the triangle, the objective brute fact. I can't argue that we have
Yes.
the words that claim to be God's words, and they're the most reliable words from the earliest manuscripts. I just don't agree with what they say.
Yep.
And you're like, that's an honest place. But it's a place where we can then go, what's keeping you from this? That's a bigger evangelistic conversation, but I wanted to just at least tease that and say, this won't be as simple as us one time seeing the data for ourselves or one time explaining it to others and then everyone's just on the same page.
Right. There's
There's a reason Bauer and Ehrman wrote their books.
They're intelligent men, right?
They're not dumb. And so we have to have that in the back of our mind. Let's move on from the existential piece. I want to talk about another piece of our cultural conversation that latches onto Bauer's thesis and what we do with that. So a big part of Bauer's thesis is that orthodoxy was not a thing until there became teeth for not following certain principles, right? So Rome is powerful. Rome then historically institutes punishments for not following what is called orthodoxy. And so that's really where orthodoxy, and because Rome was so powerful and widespread, they were able to codify the books that we have. And so it's an argument that orthodoxy is from the powerful group exerting power over the smaller group.
Right.
That really coheres, Chris, with a lot of conversations we have about truth and power today, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
How does that cohere with truth and power conversations today?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and I'm not trying to use a buzzword here, but it's Marxism. It is, it is 100% Marxism. And the idea, and even going, well, here we'll use the unholy trinity of worldview of Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche. And these three men basically, combined their forces to, accomplish some pretty awful things, quite frankly, in the 20th century. I won't use words here that are obvious, but when it comes to the idea of power, right? When worldviews shift away from, at least in Western culture, we have what would be considered a Christianly influenced culture, at least in terms of worldview, ethics, and so forth, however much it was or wasn't obeyed, right, for several hundred years. But then we get to this idea in the 19th century that really starts coming about between guys like Darwin and Marx and Nietzsche, who are of the opinion that a godless world, which is what they championed, a godless world requires power in order to accomplish anything of value. So for Darwin, power accomplishes propagation of species, right? And so the fittest survive, those who can exert the most power and will over those. So the weak and infirm no longer survive, the strong go on, right? In Nietzsche, it's the Ubermensch. He takes Darwin and he takes Marx and he ultimately puts it in a philosophical system. But then Marx is class. The strongest class has typically, kind of lorded over the underclasses. And so it is the right of the underclass to exert force against those overclasses in order to basically show them who's boss. Now, in this particular context that we're talking about, the heresy of orthodoxy, it is typical Marxist language that's being used, if we really want to kind of be honest with what's being communicated, is the language of oppression, the language of class, the language of those who are in power, those who are out of power. And the argument that's being fundamentally made here, and if we want to talk specifics of the argument itself, and we can pick it apart quite easily, but the argument that's being made by Bauer and Ehrman here effectively communicates that it wasn't until the Christian ethic of belief, Christian epistemology, didn't include any type of orthodox patterns until it was imposed from a higher authority that existed politically, a political class effectively.
Which is, ironically, what happens in Islam. So in Islam, there is a moment at which there is a dispensing with manuscript evidence that is to the contrary of the one, so that in Christianity we have manuscripts galore, thousands of them that we can compare against one another. You don't have that in Islam, because there was a unifying of the text and a burning of the things that were not in the unified thing. That is actually what Islam did to find our current Quran. And that's the claim that's what essentially what Christians did, is that there was someone who decided the set of beliefs and then burned the rest. And the reason I bring that up is because it can be a pretty popular argument to believe that really the only reasons we have doctrine or dogma or anything like that is because people in power want to maintain their power.
Right.
And I was thinking about a recent Twitter discourse where David and Bathsheba that relationship gets brought up like every 6 months between egalitarians and complementarians, and it happened, it became a fiery example during the Me Too movement, and a lot of different things and it gets pretty provocative. I won't be provocative here, but the basic assertion is David is the only guilty party because he abused his power. Because David is the one in power, Bathsheba not in power. He's the only guilty party. Sure. Bathsheba is innocent. She's the victim of an abuse of power.
Sure.
Now, one of the reasons that gets picked up as winsome is because we are in a culture where people go, oh, wow, you shouldn't abuse power, and people in power abuse power, and power is really only for abuse and keeping people downtrodden. Right. So we go, well, that makes sense. Bathsheba must have been innocent in this. Now, I don't think we need to have a pie chart of
right, innocence and guilt.
Yeah, I mean, David clearly admits his sin to the Lord, talks about sinning against him, and but there's another apologist that I think is quite helpful, Neil Shinvey, who said, oh, hey, let's pause, because if power was the only thing at play here, then why was Joseph able to not be caught in a sexual relationship with someone in power over him? Mm-hmm. And so where I think those two things help is people want to reduce things to a single variable.
Sure. Yep.
David and Bathsheba, it was about power.
Yep.
But when you say Joseph and the wife of his master, it's like, okay, that doesn't work across the board. It can't only be about power. Did David have a powerful position? Was that part of the process? Yeah, I'm sure. Right? To the degree that Bathsheba was complicit or innocent, the scriptures actually don't speak to it really. Right. But the conversation is extended there because the cultural sway of trying to blame people in power and use that as really the only issue at play. Yeah. And that comes with this thesis of how we got the Bible. It's like it was only people in power. Mm-hmm. Well, was Rome powerful? Yeah. At times. Well, is that the only issue here? No, we're going to talk about how that can't be the only issue.
Right.
And so that's what we want to caution against, is when someone says something so simple like that. It's like usually things are not one variable. Right? There, as Jordan Peterson always talks about, multivariate analysis, right? And we want to be able to say, look, the claim is that the powerful group chose what they thought was right. One question I wrote in my book, I encourage writing in books as you read. It's just a good way to process. I said, well, how did the group get big enough to be powerful in the first place?
Right.
Why was the group that claimed orthodoxy bigger tthan the heretical groups?
Yeah.
Could it be because that was the foundational movement, and though it gets corrupted over time, it was the biggest because it was the actual movement? And that's a valid question. Yeah. And really what Kostenberger and Kruger are going to argue throughout the book is that heresy is a parasite. It's not an original thing.
Yeah.
That orthodoxy is an original thing. For instance, we can get to more depth of this on the next podcast, but Docetism, which is a heresy that basically says Jesus wasn't actually God attached to a body. He appeared to be in a body.
Right.
He therefore appeared to be crucified in a body. It just seemed so. It's from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem or to appear. So he wasn't really physically here and crucified. He seemed to be so. And Kruger and Kostenberger make the point, it's like, well, that seems to really be bouncing off the fact that people are claiming he was here physically.
Saw him, right, exactly.
Yeah. And so they helpfully say, well, this heresy really seems to be bouncing off the orthodoxy piece.
Yep.
And so I think when we encounter a claim like the orthodox were the ones in power and we have orthodoxy just because the powerful implemented it, you say, well, let's just ask some questions. Why were they big enough to have power?
Yeah.
Why were the supposed powerless heretics small in number in the first place? Why, in the form of Gnosticism, why were they so spread out and ununified? Right. That's where we'll go here soon, is that early Christians were pretty unified in what they thought about Jesus as Lord and various things. So I think we have to talk about that power piece because it is a persuasive argument in modern times.
A powerful argument.
It's a powerful, yeah. Any further reflections on the power implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I really, I don't know if you want me to respond to the argument itself. I mean, I think it's honestly.
No, we're going to do that.
Yeah.
Really, this episode, I think we're continuing like, why are these things believable?
Right.
Not why are they right or wrong, but why, even if they're wrong, do we tend towards believing them in modern times?
Yeah, I mean, I think the believability behind that, just to comment on that specifically, I think the believability behind the power argument really comes down to the fact that as human beings, and here's, like, it's kind of it's a funny thing. Very few people will consider themselves to be wealthy. Very few people consider themselves to be powerful.
As for the rich in this present age, we read in 1 Timothy and we're like, yeah, I mean, we know.
Look at those rich people, right? Exactly. Now, wealth is a relative thing, certainly on one level, but when we think about power, when we think about wealth and everything, we tend to be in a place where we're always assuming that we are not in that position, right? And so the reality is that power, wealth is usually something that we view as held by others, and we usually view ourselves as those who are under somebody else, right? And so, part of it is just the way that humans respond to authority, respond to being in a position of not feeling powerful, right? Like we don't like the feeling of being powerless. And so if we can point our fingers at somebody else as the problem, as the reason why we feel powerless, then that's helpful, right? So there's a movie I watched when I was in high school called Empire Records, and there was this phrase that over and over again, it was, I'm not going to repeat the phrase, but it was blank the man. Yeah. Right? You're like the man, the capital M, like the man.
Hug.
Didn't mean like the Lord. Yeah, we'll say hug the man. The theme there was basically, there's this nameless, faceless figure that I can point to and say, you're the source of all my problems. And when it comes to the idea of, how we embrace an argument against the historicity of the Bible is to say, well, yeah, obviously we know the man has, he's the one, they're the ones, those types of people. And so we tend to, if there was scapegoating in you think about what Hitler did during, the years leading up to World War II, is he scapegoated the Jewish population in Germany, saying these people are the reason why you German people are not experiencing economic prosperity, right? Now, what's basically happened is we've gone the reverse direction when it comes to looking up and saying the reason why we don't experience economic prosperity, peace, whatever, is because there's this group of wealthy people, right? So you hear politically, make the billionaires and millionaires pay their fair share, right? Now, the reality is a millionaire will have paid more taxes this year than I will have paid my entire life, probably. That's just the reality of how things actually work. But we can always think in these terms of nameless, faceless, and it's easy to point fingers and say, yeah, Constantine, yeah, Rome, yeah, these guys, these are the ones. It's like, well, maybe learn. Maybe learn that this is not a matter of nameless, faceless. Maybe if you look at the history of how these things actually played out, it had nothing to do with power. It had everything to do with how people felt these words to be accurate. But it's easy for us to believe in the nameless, faceless entity that's causing all of our problems.
Yeah. So, I've said a couple of times we're coming in the back door here on a discussion about God's words and why we can trust them. So there's 3 parts of the book. The first is a bit of a historical understanding of Bauer's thesis, and then what we'll talk about in the next few episodes is what actually was unified for the early church in the early years. And then I think after that, the second section of the book gets into the origins of the canon. So we are actually getting to a point where we say, these are the books we know we have, that we can trust. But we're coming in, a circuitous route to say, here's why in modern times people don't believe viscerally that we can trust this old book. Right. They don't believe when there is a passage that is too supernatural to be reasonable to them. A passage that claims objective authority that is unwavering. A passage that disagrees with cultural assumptions about gender and sexuality. Yeah. That when they see that, it's easy to say, well, those aren't actually God's words. They are representative of a group that determined that this is what they believed because of their power, because of this, and really just quelch the diversity of the viewpoints. And we need to wrestle with why we believe what we believe. And that's really what we've done in these first couple episodes. One more plea to hang on, if this really isn't your flavor, is you and I, you listener and I, Chris as well, will hear a lot of things that we need to be able to handle. Things like, as I mentioned earlier, what if the resurrection isn't true? Or what if Mary wasn't really a virgin? And or you'll hear things like, well, there were other gospels. There was the Gospel of Thomas. People love the Gospel of Thomas until you actually read it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, we'll talk about the Gospel of Thomas. But there are these things that get thrown out that seem to rock us a little bit. There were other Gospels, or a popular one is, well, yes, the Bible is unerring in the original manuscripts, but we don't have the original manuscripts. Or, as we've alluded to multiple times, the Bible wasn't codified in its original form until the 4th century. You hear all these things, and we have to be able to, for our own hearts, know how to deal with that so that we're not shaken, that we can really actually believe with Jesus in his word is the words of eternal life. Because we're basing our preaching on that. We're basing our small group discipleship on that. We're basing our personal devotional time on that.
Our eternity is based on that.
We're basing our eternity on that. Yeah. And then apologetically, evangelistically, we need to be able to gently, as we'll learn in 2 Timothy, to correct our opponents with gentleness, hoping that some come to the knowledge of the truth. And there's a gentle way to say, friend, that's just not true.
Yeah.
And if we have the confidence that it's not true, we can have the ability to, I think oftentimes when I'm most stirred up emotionally, it's when I'm least confident.
Yes.
When I'm most defensive, I'm least confident. When I'm most rattled, it's because I don't act. If someone comes at me with like, hey, there's the Gospel of Thomas, I've encountered that so many times, and I'm like, dude, the Gospel of Thomas wasn't written in the 1st century by an eyewitness. It's pretty calm, right? And so one of the purposes of these series of discussions is to give us the ability to be calm in the face of opposition. Because, friend, we do have confidence that the words we have are God's words. We do, and we'll get to that. So we hope that this has been, although meandering, a helpful foundation-setting piece to discuss the New Testament that we have and its trustworthiness. So until next time, this has been A Time to Think.